Welcome back, everybody, to the newest and latest episode of BFO, your new BFS. It is me, Jonathan Arend, followed by my lovely co-hosts.
Hey, it's Sarah. Hey, everybody, it's Eliza.
Hello, everyone. It's Chris again.
And we have another very special guest. In our pantheon of guests in this podcast is possibly the best one, for not only has he given us a very detailed talking points in advance, which makes the podcasting a little bit easier, but he is literally calling from getting off a plane right now. So if you hear any sounds in the background, it's only because he is so dedicated to being a guest on this podcast that he's calling us as he is actively deep planing. So special guest, will you please introduce yourself?
Hi, so I am... I'll give my full name, Sean Tucker. That's fine. I work in the rail industry, and as you hear in the background, I'm currently deplaning because BFF, or the BFO, has become such a good BFF that I couldn't miss this opportunity to talk about it.
And we are incredibly happy and glad you are here to talk about it. So, as you know, and as our podcast listeners know, we keep this pretty casual. So we're going to open up the podcast with the same question we usually open up with all of our other guests. What gets you excited about ontology?
Wow. Okay, so what gets me excited is how foundational ontology is. So you realize one day that, hey, there has been this foundation you've been standing on. You didn't even recognize it there. And you've been using it loosely. And when you do it right, by accident, it works. But for the most part, if you could just get it structured, that would be so much better. And already I'm reaping the benefits of taking a formal, structured approach to this great foundational thing.
So did you have an experience where, as you said, you've been in kind of information technology and you maybe had heard about ontology and you began to kind of understand more about it? And you're like, whoa, I've been doing ontology. Ontology is great.
Not in that order. So I hit the wall first. There are things we're trying to do that make sense from just, a human working perspective. It seems natural and intuitive, but it's very difficult with complex data, and just couldn't get it done. And in hitting a wall and in searching for solutions in data and things like that, here comes this thing, ontology, in searches and things like that. And, initially it was this branch of philosophy, what's happening here. But then I realized, wow, this is serious, meaningful, structured work. So yeah, I met up on ontology through hitting a wall, many walls.
So as our podcast listeners know, applied ontology kind of is approached from two distinct fields that you kind of touched on. It's the philosophical side and the practical side. So between those two, is there one that you maybe prefer to work with more than the others, or do you equally enjoy the practical side of ontology and the philosophical side of it?
The thing is, so far in my experience, I'm liking the marriage of both sides. And I'll be honest with you, in the work that I sent ahead of time, you'll see that there is the marriage of the philosophical part and the implementation side. And I have to tell you, what I like is how they sync. I like where they intersect, and I would have trouble saying that I prefer one, because I like how the philosophy makes it practical, meaningful, and grounded, and I like how the practical implementation brings the philosophy to life. So
a lot of our listeners could be experiencing some similar problem sets that you have been utilizing ontology for in your field. Can you help frame out for us what problem you solved with the marriage between the philosophy side and the implementation side of ontology?
Sure, great question. So the problem, I would say the overarching problem is how do we get schemas to stand on reality? This is important when you're dealing with large data sets, like in enterprise asset management, and in large and complex data sets like geospatial data. If you have conflations, there are questions you just can't ask of the data. You know it's in there somewhere, but if you want to be very intelligent, meaningful about that data and build applications really capable of doing what you want them to do, your schema needs to be built on reality. Well, here's a challenge primarily in data engineering. Nobody walks up to you and they say, hey, this is Maximo, this is Hexagon, this is ArcGIS, and we are prepared today to rebuild it based upon ontology. No. And then you're being asked, well, this thing that has pseudo meaning, you now need to extract real meaning from it. And so the problem is twofold in that how do you build things properly in the first place? But if they are already built, how do you create this semantic surface that says, this is what the system is really trying to do, and interface with it, but you'll face some limitations because it's not fully structured. And those two things, they're very difficult to do. They're difficult to do with large data sets, complex sets. And this is what ontology is allowing us to tackle, not only if you had to build it from scratch, but what happens because most systems are already in place. How do you create this in-between surface until you can get there?
So when you were talking about the kind of like types of problems that ontology can solve, I was thinking back to my own experiences of talking to kind of key stakeholders that I work with about ontology. And I found that sometimes it's easier to sell ontology if there's a problem that already exists and you're presenting ontology as a way to solve the problem. But I'm wondering if you've ever had success in proactively recommending ontology.
First, let me give you the short answer to the question. Yes, I have sold ontology directly, but in the same environment, I had to sell ontology to solve the pain. And interestingly, I got the freeness of speech, the latitude, the recognition to sell ontology directly because I spoke about ontology as a pain reliever on so many things. So we're addressing the pain relief situations, and then now that makes ontology this friend in the background people keep hearing about. So then when, for example, the other day we were talking about, we have all these different data sources that apply to enterprise asset management and geospatial information in many different places, in many different systems. And we want to create a layer where that layer can look at all these sources, and then AI can say, how do I integrate these sources? How do they truly relate to each other? And I was able to say, well, there you go. We have to start with ontology to create that surface that can talk to everybody and say, what's really happening here? What are the real questions we can ask about the domain because of considering restrictions on the current schema and things like that? And it was like, oh, okay. And now I'm in the hunt for a solution using ontology to do that. And looking at several different sources between the UK, the Netherlands, the United States, ontology shops that are coming up and doing great work with data, especially in the geospatial sphere. So, yeah.
I have a question here, and solely because you brought up the AI usage here. I guess I want to know more about how you see ontology and AI mixing in, or how would you see an ontologist using AI to any capacity? if eventually help merge that layer in?
Oh no, great question. And this is something I've had to do a lot of practical at work research, and also connecting with Barry Smith on some of this and just speaking to people in the field. It goes back to actually the previous question. One of the first question to ask with AI and ontology is, where do we have to start? Where does it make sense to start? And I've learned that that is the important question, not where we should start, not where we should have started, because it may be too late in the game. And once you answer that question, do we start at solving a pain problem to get to a true solution, or are we rebuilding this from scratch and then you have your answer? So here's where ontology comes in. And ontology comes in terms of developing, not only understanding that there are primarily continuance and occurrence, but ontology comes in understanding for the specific domain, how will I apply this? Now, here's why I say this. In the work that I've been doing, which is how to use applied ontology for data engineering, what I came to realize was that for data engineers, you think of all these folks at my workplace who are working on this, BFO is thick. It's way too thick initially. So you have to create this in between, this minimal ontology, along with a framework of work that allows someone to say, here are the appropriate boxes to put things in, and here's how I would go about doing them. Here are the types of questions I would ask. So for example, I developed this methodology, these anti-patterns rather called, and the anti-patterns are, you don't want to do this, so you want to look out for this. And they're titled PQRS. So Q, for example, stands for a quantum entity. You look at a schema and you realize, wow, this schema has entities in there. It has events in there. So you have occurrence and continuance in the same table represented in this one table. And that's not accurate. That needs to be broken out because it means now you have conflation. So you not only have to find this in-between spot you might have to work on if BFO is not mature in the field already, which it is in biomedical, but in a field like data engineering where IT folks are impatient, you need this in-between minimal ontology that respects BFO. And in this case, for example, I came up with entity, events, states, and then artifacts and relations. And pretty much there are things that exist, there are things that happen, there are conditions or states, and then ICEs are very popular, so artifacts. But then you need to now have relations between all these things. And it turns out that this respects BFO, and it turns out that it is enough to start helping individuals to understand how to approach. So when you approach a situation, some people want to know not only what needs to be, they will ask, but is there a natural methodology that flows with this? Questions I can ask. One of the questions people want to know, can I create a prompt that respects that minimal ontology and ask AI, because I want AI to do some of this work, and AI can't do the ontological work. But if it understands what you're looking for, it turns out it can be helpful in asking questions and in making suggestions, but you still have to do the ontological work. But people want a framework, they want a model, they want a workflow to follow. Otherwise, they realize, well, this is just theory and you need to come here and do it for me anyway. This is not something I can actually put into practice. And that's challenging.
That example that you just gave is brilliant. So as we all know, like to your point, ontologies especially BFO is pretty big, but if you can take a small section of it and kind of go almost like a BFO appetizer and show it to people and kind of show them how it works, and then they get excited and they want to know, wow, like this small little thing I have can do this. Like, what could the entire ontology do for me? Like, what questions can I ask?
So the outline I sent, it outlines the structure of this book I've written, Applied Ontology for Data Engineers. And it walks through just what you're saying. It walks through reality, which is, hey, get your minimal ontology down or use BFO. Then it goes through representation, which is schema. And then it goes through things like, refactoring, and then, realization. But after chapter, so there are 5 steps that I think individuals need to go through when they're thinking about ontology and integration and all those things, from reality, representation, refactoring, things like that. But then chapter 6 touches on how to use this with AI, but chapter 7 says, if you're ready, now let's start BFO. And it's an introduction to BFO to be more strict, because you have to get there, but people have to know that they can walk up to that point, and when they're ready, they can execute the gold standard. It's in the brains and the minds of anybody who is doing any sensible work that, help me get over this thing, help me to walk, give me a process, give me a vehicle. Okay, great. Now, what happens when I want to hit the gold standard? And they want to know that that journey is outlined for them. And to your point, wow, this is what I got this thing to do. Now I'm addicted, and let's let's jump into full BFO. It really is my best friend. So yeah.
So when you show BFO in its entirety, in all its great glory, what do you think personally is the most powerful aspect of the full BFO ontology? Is it the fact that it can map spatial temporal connections? Is it the fact that it can touch upon processes, artifacts, continuants? What do you think is the most powerful thing within the whole BFO ontology?
Okay, do I have to pick one? Well,
so we asked this same question to our last guest. That guest chose 7, I believe. So 7 or less is your number.
okay, I'll go with this. I think the most powerful thing is the first thing someone sees about BFO. That there's the difference between continuance and occurrence. And I say that because at that moment, a person who is truly listening realizes, wait, these things are very different things. I'll give you an example. I said to someone the other day, your pen is different from the act of writing. And they said, yeah. I said, no, that makes sense in your brain, and you separate it. But if you don't do that deliberately, when you're working on things in life, not just data, forget it's data. When you're building a model and a structure of the world, if you don't do that deliberately, things start happening, because there are things that we just take for granted because, it's life, it's nuanced. The human mind is very, there's a lot of plasticity in how we can bend and morph things. And so we take these things for granted. And once somebody, I think, appreciates that first separation, I think that's it. Then, if I could pick a second best thing, I would say when individuals, once they recognize that there are conditions, and they say, wait, the world is a lot more dissected than I thought it was. And I think at that point, that is where the power is, because once you get individuals to accept that the world is divided and segmented, but related, they say, and I think that's where the power is, because everything that follows after that it's a matter of trust that just flows. So that has been my experience for just me. That was my experience, and that's the experience I try to pass on in communicating BFO, and it sticks.
Sean, related, you talked about BFO as the gold standard. What initially drew you to BFO?
Well, the fact that BFO, and it's a bit of bias drew me to BFO, I have to admit. When I looked at the history of BFO and realized that Barry Smith initially worked on BFO, considering geospatial concerns, that to me, not only because of it's the field I work in primarily, you're dealing with the things in that domain and what's happening with them, their status, how things are related, and it can get quite complex. But whatever that field is, you can get up and add to that field two things: space and time. I know you have a geospatial version of that system, and the addition of those two things, space and time, how they behave and how they interact, we think we understand them as humans, and it's the space-time battle in the world of geography is challenging, and the more people dig and the more answers you get in that field is the more you realize you don't know. And I'll give a very simple example. There's a problem out there called the Modifiable Areal Unit Problem. You can look this up, MAUP. And what it turns out is it's saying, well, depending on how high, technical, and I'm being illustrative here, depending on how high you're viewing things from, 30,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 15,000 feet, the world could look different and interactions could look different. So I'll give an example with the census. If you look at census data, and you're just looking at census data from the standpoint of tables and information, and you examine it that way, that's fine. But when you start saying this city, this county, and you say, okay, this county has a median income of X, but then you realize that people next to this county are in another county that's cheaper, they work over here. You start asking, how do those factors of nearby things influence this thing? And things become quite... And so the geospatial world is very complex when you start talking about it, when you start trying to represent it. What is really a feature in the world? Is there really such a thing as a point? I mean, it depends on the resolution. Are your polygons really lined up? Should we call them polygons? There's still a naming battle going on in the geospatial world. So once I realized that Barry Smith was using BFO to solve meaning in the geospatial world, I said, this has to be deeply comprehensive. And that was my sell initially. Then there was the ISO standard. Yes.
There's so much to unpack, Sean, in what you just laid out for us. If I may just sort of hone in on one piece of that, because I know that we had a difficult time explaining to our IT folks exactly what we were trying to do with ontology and our data. With your immense background in the IT field and all the work that you have done, is there something that you believe our audience could utilize to help explain ontology to our IT experts in the field for when we want to bring this into our systems?
Yeah, the communication barrier. That's a great question. I've been trying to find a set of single sentences, short sentences. For example, to the database folks, I say, our schema is smart. Ontology is going to make it smarter. To the application folks, I'll say, our schema and our UI interface, they're great. Ontology will make sure that we have less refactoring to do in the future, because it's going to start from the reality, and then it will tell us, hey, just bite off the piece of reality that you can handle right now. Instead of what we do now is we keep refining towards reality. So I say BFO is working from the end, coming back, and that's great. And speaking, I think, invent a word here, depainting language, I think is the best thing. And it's usually best I've found to start at the punchline. And so, like I said, for a data person, the punchline is this will make our schema smarter. And you never tell folks who love their systems, like if they love Maximo or Hexagon, you never tell them it's going to make it smart, because then they say, oh, what are you saying? The system is dumb, and the system is not great. And they may feel that way, but they individuals get personal about these systems. So what I would say to folks in the IT world is this is a type of refactoring that is going to pay back in ways that no other refactoring has paid back. And whether that ontology applies to data, whether it applies to forms, screens, things like that, whatever the application is, I would say this is just refactoring. And then I would give the safety net, and I would say the great thing is when we refactor, it will also tell us the bridge to build between now and better, because that's true. And I think that's one of the things we probably need to talk more about deliberately in ontology. We know it intuitively. UB knows it intuitively, but we have to give people the safety net deliberately by saying, not only will this signal to us where we should be, because of the journey we will take, it will also build the bridge of how we should get there. And people need to feel safe. And that's it. I hope that answers. But if you have a very specific scenario, I'd love to hear it and think about it a bit.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Sean. The bridge between now and better. And you're absolutely right that you have to give people those compliments. We're coming in our minds to fix things, but you can't just show up and say you have problems, right? Recognize the work that's already been done. We've gotten this far, and we just want to make it better. And a lot of times the words we use are future proof. That can be controversial sometimes, or flexible, something that can build upon itself. I have a question there. Sorry.
No. No, you have unintended sensitivity that's just coming with our exuberance. I mean, this is great stuff. It's hard not to be excited about it, but we have to contain ourselves and have a sense of compassion for those we are communicated with. They're just as frustrated as we are, but this is a little enlightenment that we need to find a good way to present, because every day people hear about solutions. They hear, oh yeah, this is great. This will solve the problem. That will solve the problem. AI will do this. This will do that. And is this just another thing that they have to filter out? And I think the way to address that is with a sense of like compassion, empathy, and safety. And then people stop and they listen. And once they're listening, and we can show them in that non-threatening way, and build that bridge, and then all this, they're not threatened by future proofing anymore. They want it.
Well, Sean, this has been a fantastic conversation. We are coming up to the end of our podcast, and how we usually end our podcast, we give everybody one more chance to ask a final question, and then we have a question from the godfather of ontology himself, Professor Barry Smith.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So before we get to his question, my question is, I really loved, much like Sarah did, your expression of building a bridge to the better, like a better state. Now, if you had a magic wand, you could create any ontology you want to build that bridge to get to a better place. What would that ontology be?
It would be a meta-ontology. It would be an ontology of information seeking, right? And information science is interesting. I'm trying to figure still where UB puts applied ontology. If it's strictly on a philosophy or there's some, but in information seeking, there's been a lot of work done recent times, especially by just great women like Kuhlthau, on how do we seek information? Now, when you think about it, that's so foundational. How does a person go about seeking information? Because if you could knock that down, you would be asking and answering questions before people are asking and answering them, right? So you've had some research done, for example, how do people surf the internet? How do they, search for things back and forth? And if I think if that ontology could be created, it would be powerful in the world of not only how people search and how people go about finding things, but informing the workflow of intelligence and saying when a person is going, and here's why I call it a meta-ontology. When someone approaches this ontology, this portion of the biomedical field, how are they going to go about seeking? How will they go about seeking information? Wow, that's a meta of the meta.
Sean, in very specific terms, can you tell us one real-world question that you've made easier to answer, or a process that you've streamlined in the realm of spatial and asset management for transportation using BFO or ontologies?
Question is, have I proven it? Well, in transportation and the geospatial space, there's something everybody needs, everybody uses, but it's irritating. It's called LRS, Linear Reference System. Now, think of LRS very simply. The simplest way to think of it is you imagine a ruler, and you want to know whether you're talking about cars or trains or planes. You want to know where something is, where it was, where it will go, the line or how it will traverse to get there. And this is so natural to us. It's very difficult. And however, I believe in my initial testing of EESAR, which, by the way, not only is it a minimal ontology from my perspective, at least. Barry will have to help me prove that out. It is purposely done that way because EESAR can be pronounced easier. It's supposed to make BFO easier. But just to say, it turns out that if you look at LRS, especially as implemented by ESRI, the industry standard in geospatial transportation, you can break out LRS to be more nuanced and to prevent it from creating errors that when you have an LRS system, you have to baby it because it will allow you to do things that are not right because depending on the context, it could be right. So how do you control that while having the latitude, but how do you control it in terms of context? You need an ontology. You need things to be defined ontologically. You need conditions and certain things to be specified and certain states and certain relationships where the system will say, oh, you can't do that because what you will do is you will put the 0 point behind the current 0 point, and that makes no sense, right? So now you have a negative transition of distance where you want to say, well, no, everything needs to be positive because it has a direction and it's counting down from 0 up. So I'm speaking to a connection at ESRI that works in transit, and we're going to get together on that and we'll be digging in the trenches. And if that is proven, I would say it would be a huge victory for BFO, not for EESAR, because that's just BFO compliant. And in fact, I put that person in touch with Barry, and I'm hoping that we can really solve it because LRS is massive, but everyone fears it. It is a monster that everyone needs and everyone dreads. So, yep.
Sean, could we just, I'm thinking of just like combining 2 points that you brought up in our conversation. In the beginning, you had mentioned how when you're working to create the semantic surface to show what a system is, but you face limitations because you're relying on things sometimes like ArcGIS that aren't built based on ontology. You then, and you said you needed to create kind of this like in-between surface until you can get there. Is the way that you build that in-between surface the anti pattern that you said that you developed with putting things in categories and buckets of things that exist, things that happen, and then conditions or states, and then the ICE's artifacts? Like, is that how you create the in-between state when you have to use systems that aren't built on ontology? How do you do that?
Well, thankfully, no. Thankfully, that's not how it's done.
Right. Okay.
You have to work backwards from BFO. So you need to look at BFO. I would suggest to anybody who's looking at building a minimal ontology, and I think it'd be a great like 2 or 3 session class for Barry to develop. He's the expert. You have to look at BFO and say, starting with continuance and occurrence, and then the other things that apply to that field, what is the essence of their representation for that field? And you have to think minimal. You want to think very basic. So for example, event, right? In therefore you could have processes, you could have but a data engineer, process means something else to a data engineer, right? And there are several other words in that field. When you say event, they think, oh, something that happens. That works when we click a button, when we do this, when we do that. So language becomes a part of it where you're looking at BFO and initially you're saying, well, let me just take what's needed from BFO and then let me play with the language so that the language is meaningful and acceptable. So it is a 2-part thing. There is a compression thing, and then there's a communication thing. So you work from BFO to compress BFO down to the essentials for what's needed. And then you say, what's the communication thing in terms of how I name these things? If you go to a data engineer and you say, hey, continuance and occurrence, they're like, I don't need any more words. I have enough words. So those are the 2 overarching things I would say in achieving that. Because if you try to work from your assumptions toward hoping it will fit into BFO, that's not really a realist approach. And you develop a lot of bias and you could just be telling yourself what you want to hear. Then you end up in an anti-ontology situation. So, yeah.
Hey, Sean, just want to thank you once again for being, taking the time, deep planing and all, and getting into an Uber or Lyft right now.
No problem.
Well, appreciate the time right now, brother. But let me take a bit of a step back here. You said a lot of interesting stuff, and I feel like we could probably extend this talk for like 3 hours if we really had the time for it. But I want to take a step back, and I want to bring up something that generally is like a battle for a lot of ontologists, I want to say, in the sense that what you just brought up at the end of your last point here was trying not to create this bias for yourself. It seems like with ontologies, like the ultimate goal is this data interoperability, the great alignment of all systems, of all data silos would be amazing, right? But yeah, it seems like sometimes you're working in an environment where you're working on specific systems that are, the data is, it's great to the degree that the person has brought it up to, but it maybe needs more work. I guess the question is, how do you keep yourself from getting into sort of creating more data silos? Just keep heading towards this like sort of data interoperability goal that is generally in the field.
Well, first, I don't think I could have said it any better. Just admit it's going to be a data silo. And we're heading into the age of data swamps, right? And data puddles. I think there's a 2-edged sword that cuts good. It cuts well both ways, to answer your question. And it is when you walk up to someone and you say, we're going to use ontology to not only get the most out of the data, but to make sure that we can keep the data where it is. We don't want to move your data. I don't know if you've ever said that to executives where you work, like VP, but when you say things like that, it's the strange music that hypnotizes them. Because you are saying, you're saying, let's not upset your universe. Let's just look at what you have. You've got it. And, you know, they, they look at you all gleefully, it's interesting. So I would say that in that very thing, that's what you say to folks. Look, you don't want to create more data spots, more things to track. We want to look at things where they are, and we want to look at things as they are. And we should be able to do that. With AI, the problem is AI doesn't have the translation layer. So what we're doing here is not only making sure that we can look at your data in place, our data in place, and so on and so forth, but that we're giving AI this bridge. It can go back and forth over, it can use this surface. And so we are enabling AI. So one of the phrases I've enacted where I am by sending out enough emails and using this phrase is enabling AI. And after a while, so you have to develop a lingo that feels good, that will be reused. You use it, you keep using it, people start using it, and the understanding spreads that way. And they understand, no more silos. And that's all. So many people want that.
Absolutely, Sean. Repetition is key. So we have one more question for you, and this comes straight from the godfather himself, Barry Smith, the founder of BFO. His question for you: would it help to solve problems of interoperability if BFO was taken over by the government?
Wow, this feels so much like a Star Trek versus Star Wars problem. Okay. My answer to that is going to be no. I'll tell you why. Government and public service is interesting. Public service serves the public, but it has these restraints. And so government on their own cannot run as fast with these things as they should. So even I would say the government can proliferate it in ways that make it easy for industry and other things to run with, but take it over is challenging, because once the folks who can truly run with it, academia on the research side and private enterprise, where there's a lot of just free thinking and innovation, once they feel they can't own this too, then you're back to the days when all the land in a domain belonged to the king. And yeah, people would work, but it was interesting when people started to be able to own land. And I think Barry discusses this maybe in ontology economics. Once people start to be able to own land, a sense of enterprise was different. So the government is powerful. The government has reach. The government can proliferate. However, the government cannot innovate at the pace and the rate needed, and at the freeness needed. I think if because BFO works, as with many other things and standards that the government mandates, they can do reasonable mandates. They can do reasonable mandates that encourage, that light, that fire. So for example, they could say, hey, look, this is what we're working with agriculture. This is how we have decided that we're going to frame things that are organic and grow them. We're using ontology, whatever the case is. And they say, so we hold you to the standard. And what will start happening is people start standing on that standard. So I think if the government is smart, they won't try to own it, but they will own proliferating it in the soil of society, and in soils that people will put their roots down and innovate. So that's my thought. They have an ownership role, but the ownership role is not owning it. It's owning the responsibility of proliferation.
So smart. Leave it to the people who can move as fast as it needs to move. And then the government should buy into something this smart, because it means everybody who uses BFO will also be able to use all of the government data that's publicly available. It's wonderful. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah. And I think I'll just say this. Lithuania, is it Lithuania now? Where is it? They went they went e-government like in the 90s. Is it Lithuania? Anyway, but there's some interesting, like, you can do everything, I think, in Lithuania online except for like process your death certificate. Everything. And it's blockchain control. The government proliferated technology. So yeah, there's some models out there about how to do something without actually owning it and restricting people. Yeah, we can follow those models.
Well, this has been a fantastic, fantastic conversation. I don't know how we keep finding the best people to be guests on our podcast, but every guest creates a new threshold of being an awesome guest for the next person to meet. So, Sean, you have set the bar quite high. Podcasters, that's us signing off. So this is John. Thank you so much for tuning in.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Keep up the BFF. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for listening.
If anybody else wants to say bye, I can splice in the audio so it'll sound like we all said it in sequence.
Until next time, podcasters.
Until next time, everybody.